We open up to Julia as she rides a taxi through the city with Francis, and the driver asks Julia if she speaks the language. She admits that she's fresh to the area, and he seems to get a little offended. Apparently, what he's really saying is that she's absolutely beautiful, and he helps unload the bags once they reach their destination. After the driver leaves, Francis and Julia make their way to their apartment building, where their landlord escorts them to their apartment. Once inside, Julia heads over to the window to look at the view of the neighboring apartment building. I can't live that close to other people anymore. The absolute first thing I would have unpacked is a whole bunch of curtains. Those windows are huge and they're literally close enough to the other building that they could toss a bag of sugar back and forth if one of them needed it. After the landlord leaves, Francis takes a deep breath and he comes over to check on Julia. He wastes no time in laying her down on the couch and they get really personal with each other. Later that night, Julia lies in bed, and she eventually gets up when she can't get to sleep. She takes a moment to look out the window, and she notices some of her neighbors as they go about their lives. Eventually, she spots one man in a higher apartment that simply stands in his room and stares back at her. Francis wakes up to notice Julia standing at the window, and he has her come back into bed with him. After a little while, Julia gets up and she starts to listen to Romanian language classes while she unpacks. Feel like this is something she should have started working on before getting to Romania. First impressions have already been made. Julia hears the neighbor woman getting physical and laughing with someone, and she decides to go to a nearby cafe. She manages to speak enough Romanian to order a coffee, and when she gets back to her building, she looks up to the creepy man's window. That night, she lays in bed and notices the figure in the same room, but she simply rolls over and goes to sleep. The next day, Julia heads to a cathedral in town, but she gets run out by a man she can't understand. She takes a walk through town and finds a Dracula figure that she buys before heading home. Once home, she notices that her door isn't closed, and she gets startled when the landlord and maintenance man leave after fixing her light. Is it not custom in other places that the landlord has to give you a heads up before barging into your apartment for maintenance? That evening, Julia drinks a glass of wine while she waits for Francis to get home. But she grows impatient and looks across to the neighboring apartment building again. As she stands in her window, she turns off the light and notices the man staring back at her again. Suddenly, Francis arrives and questions why she's standing in the dark, and he thanks her for the Dracula figure before taking her out into the cold. As they walk, he presents her with a flower, but they eventually come across a scene where people are gathered with the police. Everyone seems rattled, but no one knows what happened. The next day, Julia watches the news, and Francis tells her that a young girl was found murdered there. This really hits Julia, and even Francis is wondering why it's hitting her so hard. Murders happen all the time, and sometimes they happen way closer than you'd think without even knowing. Julia is just really spooked because of the neighboring stalker, though. She forgets that she's stalking him back, though. At this point, it's like a game of chicken to see who turns away first. Julia tells Francis about the man, but she turns around and acts like it's nothing. That evening, Francis and Julia head over to his coworker's apartment for dinner, and Julia opens up about how she's reevaluating her career choice. Francis tells them about the dead girl crime that they ran into the other night, and they find out that the girl had her head cut off. On top of that, it's connected to a string of similar attacks on young women, and Julia takes her dish to the kitchen. Then, Julia decides to step out to take out the trash, and she notices her neighbor saying goodbye to her man. As Julia walks by, the neighbor asks if she can hear her in the apartment, and Julia lies and says that she can't. The neighbor introduces herself as Irina, and they go their separate ways. The next day, Julia goes for a walk through town again, and she notices a newspaper that talks about the dead girl. She heads to the cafe again to look up the girl's name, and she finds that she's actually the fourth body discovered in a series of attacks. She finds a video of one of the potential victims, and the woman talks about how the man watched her in her sleep and held a knife to her while he watched her. The woman pointed out that she felt like someone was watching her long before the incident, though. Now Julia's paranoia is really going. She heads to the theater, and she finds herself a nice squeaky chair to sit in. Eventually, a man comes in, and he sits in a squeaky chair right behind her. She senses his presence, and eventually, she turns around a little to notice that he's in the seat directly behind her. The entire theater's basically empty. You don't do that. Ugh! Then he leans in and breathes super heavy on her ear. No thank you. After that, Julia heads to the store to buy some cigarettes even though she's trying to quit. Yeah, that would make me want to pick it back up too. She decides not to get it, and she goes shopping for food instead. While in the produce section, she notices that someone else is seemingly following her, and she goes around the corner to try and test her theory. When she notices that it's the same shoes from the theater, she starts to panic. She ends up going to the back room of the store, and she looks out to see if he's still tailing her. The man does actually come to the back of the store, and Julia ends up getting one of the workers to show her where the back door is. That evening at dinner, Julia doesn't seem present for Francis's conversation, and she tells him about the man from earlier. Hey, look at that, they got curtains. A little late now that the stalker's seemingly confirmed. Now I'd want the windows open so someone else can witness whatever crime happens. It's too late for you. He mentions that the market should have security tapes, and they go back there the next day to ask about the cameras. They head to the back with the manager, and they find the man that Julia's talking about. Needless to say, Francis ends up gaslighting her. And I'm only saying that because this man is literally following all of the creeper status rules. Look at the way he walks after her. His head's on a swivel to keep her in his sights too. The next day, Francis tells Julia that he's going to be out a little late, since he has to entertain some clients. And Julia sits by the window and watches the neighboring apartment building all day. That night, Julia gets interrupted by a knocking at the door, and she answers to find an elderly Romanian woman. Irina explains that the woman is looking for her cat, and afterwards, she invites Julia over for a drink. After sitting and talking for a moment, a man shows up at the door to call on Irina, but she sends him off. Julia asks her what she does if he crosses a line, and Irina shows her the gun that she keeps in the table. Julia ends up having a great visit, but when she goes back to her apartment, she checks on the creeper's window. She tries to convince herself that he's not really looking in, but when she puts a hand up to wave, he waves back. Okay, that's definitely creepy. Time to move. Francis eventually gets home, and he finds Julia sitting on the bed, smoking. She tells him about the man waving back to her, and Francis goes to the window to check. When he looks out the window, he notices that the light is off, but Julia assumes that the man is still there. Julia decides that she wants to call the police. When they get there, the policeman tries to ask her for more information, but she doesn't have much definitive evidence. The policeman agrees to go check on the apartment in question, and Francis goes with him. When he gets back, he tells Julia that this might not be as crazy as she thinks it is, but she feels like he's talking down to her. She tells him that all she wants is for him to believe her, but he keeps trying to point out that it could be anything other than what she thinks. Gaslighting's not cool, but Francis is playing both sides of the table here. He tries to help her. He goes to the store to check cameras, he calls the police for her, and he's literally checking everything like she could be right. But the second things look like they might not be, he hops on that train immediately. The next day, Julia goes out, and she spots the man from the store again. She decides to be the stalker this time, and she follows him. She follows him all day until they come to an underground strip club, but she still follows him in. She looks around inside for the man until she finds him working the mop and bucket in the janitor's closet. Then he senses her looking at him, and Julia hides in a private booth. Suddenly, Irina pops up as one of the strippers, and she takes her to the back to ask about Julia's stalker. She tells her about the man, but Irina plays it off like it might be nothing at all. Julia heads home and she barricades the door with a chair before laying down for a bit. If Francis didn't think that she was crazy before, I think him coming home to a door being barricaded by a chair would definitely do the trick. Then, Julia has a dream about an intruder throwing a pillowcase over her head and beating her. But when she wakes up, she hears a thud from Irina's apartment. She knocks on the wall and calls to Irina, but when she hears a scream and something break, she rushes into the hallway to try and get Irina to open up. She causes such a ruckus that the neighbors come out, and eventually, the landlord comes up to open the door. It turns out that all she heard was the cat knocking over a lamp, and the old neighbor is happy to find her cat. The next day, the landlord has a serious conversation with Francis, and he tells Julia that the landlord doesn't want tenants that cause trouble. Francis heads to work, and Julia calls the strip club about Irina's whereabouts. After getting off the phone with them, she hears furious knocking in the hallway again, and she comes out to see Irina's ex knocking. Julia tries to ask if he knows anything about her whereabouts, and she tries the number he gives her. She hears Irina's phone going off inside, and she decides to ask the ex to help her. They head to the neighboring apartment building, and she asks him to knock on the door of the creepy apartment so she can see if it's the same person she thought was following her. He knocks on the door, but there's no answer. He decides to yell a warning into the apartment and heads out. What does Julia do now? She heads to the apartment in question, of course. Because that's what you do when you think someone's stalking you. If you think someone's stalking you, do not do this. Julia knocks politely on the door and an old man comes out. After seeing him, Julia decides to leave. But once she gets to the elevator, she spots the stalker on the stairs. As she goes down the elevator, the stalker watches her, and now Julia has her confirmation. That evening, Julia gets ready for her night with Francis, but the police show up. The police are there with the stalker, Daniel, and he's there to complain about Julia harassing him. The policeman gives them the option to leave this as a misunderstanding on both parties' part, and Daniel extends his hand to shake. Julia gently shakes his hand, and she goes back to the bedroom. After the police leave, Francis shows Julia an article that says that the serial killer that was attacking the girls had been caught. Is that supposed to be comforting? Daniel looks 20 times creepier than that dude ever could. That evening, Francis and Julia head to a work function, and Julia shows that she knows enough Romanian to catch on to the little office joke that Francis said about her. Julia stomps out, and Francis tries to catch up to her. When he does, he tells her that he's just so tired from trying to keep up with her delusions, and he leaves her on her own. As she walks around the town, she winds up going to the train station and she can hear another person coughing from around the corner. Before she can see who's there, the train shows up and she hops on. As the train continues, she looks down into one of the other cars and she spots Daniel as he watches her. Eventually, Daniel comes over and sits across from her, and he tries to make creepy small talk since the train stopped. Finally, she asks him why he's following her, and he explains that one of his sad hobbies is to look at the people outside his window since he takes care of his sick father. He says that no one's really ever noticed, but when she waved to him, he thought that that was her being friendly. Julia notices the bag he has, and she thinks that she sees a head in it. Finally, the train starts moving again, and Julia gets off at the next stop. When she gets home, she breathes a sigh of relief, and she immediately sits on the bed. After a moment, she grabs her suitcase and starts packing her things. This should have happened after the grocery store incident. When Julia hears music turn on in Irina's apartment, she decides to go over to check on her, and she notices that the door's unlocked. The old cat lady watches as Julia steps into Irina's apartment, and she takes a look around. When Julia gets to the bedroom, she finds Irina's body in the chair without her head, and suddenly, Daniel covers Julia's head with a bag. When she comes to, Daniel tells Julia that he'd been hiding in the closet when he came for Irina that one night, and he holds a knife to her throat to shut her up. When he takes the bag off of her, they can hear Francis in the apartment next door looking for her, but Daniel slices her throat when she tries to scream. Ruthless. This is definitely not Daniel's first time. He cuts her just enough for her to slowly bleed out, and she can't scream out. At least Julia remembered about the gun in the coffee table, though. Why'd they give us that hope, though? She's gone. But a little girl is watching from the apartment building across the way. See, now you want no curtains so that the crime is seen. Told you. Daniel cleans himself up and gets ready to leave when Francis calls Julia and hears her phone next door. Francis spots Daniel in the hall and he tries to run over to him. Suddenly, 2 gunshots from Irina's apartment put Daniel on the ground, and we see Julia standing there. Then the credits roll. That was a solid thriller. There were a couple of times that made you question if it was actually a stalker, but in the end, you were just curious on how he would get caught. Give it a shot. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more like this one. Comment what you think I should watch next, and I'll see you in the next video.